Good morning. So I want to go over my talk here this morning with you guys. Thanks for coming so early. So what I want to discuss here is there's a little bit of intersection with the previous talk as well, but I want to discuss cross-domain orchestration and automation with Action Orchestrator. So generally what I want to discuss is give you a brief introduction of what Action Orchestrator is, let you know some of the use cases around Action Orchestrator, go over some of the features and the main concepts, and then I will get past all that boring stuff and go into the live demo. So Action Orchestrator is a new product. It's our advanced workflow orchestration and automation solution. And these are terms that are a little bit overloaded these days, orchestration in particular. So orchestration doesn't just mean configuration. It also means, it does include configuration, but it also means directing different actors potentially in different domains to achieve a singular goal, kind of like an orchestra playing along to the same piece of music. Automation, obviously, we get into scheduling and triggering of events. So Action Orchestrator is going to be part of the Cloud Center 5.0 suite. If you saw the keynote yesterday, this was mentioned, the Cloud Center 5.0 release coming out soon. So Action Orchestrator, if you recall, David Geckler mentioned there was an orchestration component to Cloud Center suite. This is the orchestration component to which he was referring. So Action Orchestrator, the concept there, it's not necessarily tied to the Cloud Center suite. It is a part of the Cloud Center suite, and it does enable features within the Cloud Center suite. However, it is an orchestration solution that is beyond, not necessarily just inside the domain of Cloud Center Suite. It does orchestrate the products within the Cloud Center Suite, but it can also be used to orchestrate across any external domain to which it can speak. And to that end, I say that it's highly flexible. When we're orchestrating across different components, they may be REST endpoints, they may be SDKs, they may be SSH. And I'll go into later about how you can even configure beyond to any specific use case. But that's what I mean by it being highly flexible. Action Orchestrator is sort of the next generation of Process Orchestrator, which is a Cisco product that has been around for quite some time. It's a very popular Cisco product. Any of you who are Cisco employees may be familiar with using eStore within Cisco. Cisco Process Orchestrator is the engine behind eStore, so it's been very heavily used by Cisco IT and by many large organizations outside of Cisco. Concept here is that we're taking the ideas behind Process Orchestrator, behind that successful product, and we're bringing it into the next generation, a little more modern context. So, Action Orchestrator, similarly to the rest of the Cloud Center suite, runs inside of a Kubernetes cluster. It's highly scalable, highly fault tolerant, fully cloud native. We're also updating the interface, and now the interface is all web-based. And we're going with a highly modular design, whereas Process Orchestrator in the past was based on a Windows server and had some limitations therein. This goes with a much more modular design from a UI and from a back-end perspective. So, just make sure I'm okay. Some of the use cases here, generally the concept is you would be designing workflows that would stitch together processes across potentially different domains. It could be within a single domain, meaning you have a product that exposes a number of interfaces, and you might create a workflow to run those processes to achieve some business result, handing down data from one action to the next. It can be across different domains, though. It doesn't have to be within the same product. It doesn't have to be a Cisco product. We also have a seamless integration with the other parts of the Cloud Center suite. So we have activities specifically geared toward other pieces of the Cloud Center suite, so that we can very seamlessly integrate. And some of those use cases are For example, if you're familiar with Cloud Center as it is now, Cloud Center is sort of a workload automation tool. You can build applications within your domain, and multi-tier applications. And right now there is sort of a scripting-based action interface. So this is going to deprecate that and become a much more flexible action interface that will perform actions as day zero actions. So when you're actually provisioning your workload, or it can be as lifecycle actions later. You want to scale, you want to delete, you want to update. So these workflows that we're creating here can be used in that context. Similarly, or rather conversely, you can begin your activities from Action Orchestrator and then drive actions across other members of the Cloud Center suite. To that end, we have a number of out-of-the-box adapters that I might refer to as kind of primitives. So they handle things like running scripts via SSH, making REST calls, sort of the general activities that you can use to drive across many different domains, not requiring any particular kind of adapter, just very highly flexible. And you can take those adapters together to create your new integrations. That's sort of the basis of Action Orchestrator. But then we also have the ability for customers, clients, workflow designers to build their own adapters. So for example, if you have an SDK that you need to integrate with, you can use our templates, which we have templates in Java, Golang, and Python currently, and we're expanding beyond that. It's not limited to those, but those are the templates we have. You can use those to build your own custom adapters. Although depending on your integration may not require an adapter per se. It could be, your integration is, for example, what I'm going to show today with DNA Center, it's all exposed by REST APIs. So there's no need for a specific adapter for that. So beyond that, you can run a workflow in a ad hoc manner, but also automate them based on external events. So you receive an email, or a message comes across a Kafka queue, or you get a webhook. Those are external events, and those external events can be used to drive workflows, to kick workflows off, or according to a schedule. You can define your own custom schedule. Say you're a K through 12 organization and you want to run your grading workflow according to your grading schedule, every 6 weeks or so. So you can define your own custom schedule. And of course, logging and reporting is all included in the Cloud Center Suite framework. So some of the features, I think most importantly, it is 100% REST API based. So I'm going to show you our UI, and I love our UI, but you don't need it. You can do the whole thing with REST APIs. Nothing that I'm going to show you in the UI is not available in the REST API. And within our interface, we have a full Swagger documentation, so you can try everything out within the interface itself. Workflows, while you're working on workflows, they're being automatically backed up to our internal database, but then you can also import, export, and share workflows via Git. Your own Git, it can be an internal Git, an external Git, doesn't matter, just as long as it can reach it. You can design your workflows in a modular fashion that you can create tiny bits of workflows and combine them together into a larger workflow or a set of larger workflows. It opens up this modular way of thinking that's similar to those of you, obviously, who are software engineers. To that end, we also have the ability to read external events, as I mentioned, like an email or a message on a Kafka queue, and use that context from said event to drive a workflow, to pull that data from the event. You get an email that says approved, right? And you want to run a workflow when you get an approved email. So then you can pull the context from that email, pull the sender, that kind of thing. So that's what I mean by events. And approvals are driven through events as well. So approvals are basically events, right? You want to stop a workflow and wait for an approval to happen. Say you're provisioning something and you need your supervisor to chime in to say, yes, I approve this, so the workflow can stop and wait for that approval event to come in. And then you can also publish approval events from the workflows. Logical operators, so as software engineers, we all know the for each, conditionals, loops, and all of that. All of that is available. Similarly, variables, typical variable types, Boolean, string, all of that. But you can also create custom variable types where essentially they work like tables, but they're your own custom variables that you can then use to drive data models. And then lastly, I want to mention our scripting interface. So right now we're supporting Python. So say, for example, you're running a workflow and you need just a little bit of something that's not available as an out-of-the-box adapter. We support Python 2.7 and Python 3x. You can write up just a quick little node in Python that will execute within your workflow. And it's not up here, but one of the headaches that I've experienced using Python to try to drive workflows through Jenkins, for example, is that when you run a workflow in Jenkins, you run your Python and then your variables are gone. You can't access that data. You can only sort of drive something, but you can't really interact with it unless you like write it out to a file, read it back. Here you can run Python, and then downstream in your workflow you can actually access your data, your variable from within your Python as a downstream variable. I'm talking about a lot of things that I haven't really explained yet, so let me talk about the main concept. So workflow, obviously, series of steps to achieve a business result. Adapters are internal services within our Kubernetes cluster that expose activities. So we have an adapter for HTTP requests. So you can make an HTTP request through the HTTP adapter. You can drive AWS through our AWS adapter, and the actions within that are like, create a VPC or that sort of thing. And the action itself is the single step within a workflow that has that is atomic. It produces a result. Variables are, you can configure your variables from within the workflow to say, you don't know what that's going to be, but you know that this will be a variable that comes from this activity. So defined at runtime, you can either create them ahead of time and assign them from activities, or you can access properties of activities directly. And I'll show you that here in just 1 minute. Targets are remote systems. So if I'm making a REST call, my system that is serving up that REST that REST endpoint is my target. Account key would be those credentials on that remote target, not necessarily REST, but something, if it's SSH, it's your cert or user ID and password if you really want to do that. Event would be like basically any adapter can expose some sort of external event that happens that can drive a workflow that you can trigger with. And lastly, trigger to say that your workflow starts or is resumed by that event. So, a lot of things, but maybe I just need to show. So I will do that now. Where are we? Okay. I'm having issues with my mouse here, not wanting to. Seems like my mouse is not happy with okay. That's not good. Somehow I've limited my mouse here. Sorry for the technical issue here. Trying to. I think it has to do with my. Here, let me disconnect very briefly. There we go. Sorry. Okay. Let's see if this resolves it. Okay, I apologize there. So, as I mentioned before, the software is available as part of the Cloud Center suite. So here we have our login to the Cloud Center Suite. Initially, when we release in February, Cloud Center Suite will be an on-prem solution. Shortly thereafter, we're going to go into SaaS. That was also mentioned in David Geckler's speech yesterday. So that's kind of exciting. Within the Cloud Center Suite right now, there's Action Orchestrator, which I'm going to be showing you, Workload Manager, which is the classic Cloud Center functionality, and then Cost Optimizer, which is another member of the Cloud Center Suite that allows you to estimate and generate cost reports based on your cloud usage. So looking more closely at Action Orchestrator, some of these concepts I talked about before, workflows. So I have a number of workflows here that I've created. On the left-hand side, I can view the runs of said workflow. So every time you run a workflow, it shows up here under runs, and you can inspect, and I'll show you that here in a moment. The targets, the remote systems I mentioned, account keys, those credentials. Variables, you can create global variables, calendars and schedules, so you can create custom calendars, as I mentioned. Defining of events, that API docs I was telling you about, so basically everything within AO is available all within our API docs here. It's fully functional. It uses your logged in credentials as you would expect from Swagger. So looking a little more closely at a workflow, I'm going to do a workflow here, and this workflow, it kind of gives you an example of what I mean by cross-domain orchestration. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to take DNA Center, and I wanted to take WebEx Teams. Now DNA Center, WebEx Teams, by the way, WebEx Teams, formerly Spark, for those of you that are not Cisco, or maybe you know, they don't have an interface with one another. So I wanted to create a workflow that would first reach out to WebEx, or to DNA Center, gather a list of network devices, and for any network devices that were having issues, I want to create a new WebEx Teams room, invite my engineers to that room, and notify them of issues that have been found within a network. So my business result is basically that, the combining those two. So you can sort of see how this opens up the possibility to stitch together any product that you might have, or to build workflows internally. Something that maybe in the past you might have done with Python scripts, but this is a way that is far more supportable and self-documenting. So on the left-hand side, I mentioned before our adapters. So, and this is not exhaustive of all the adapters. This particular environment only has certain adapters loaded, but our adapter list is extremely long. The list of adapters has the activities within that adapter, and then you can drag that activity onto the canvas. As you can see here, we have support for lots of things out of the box: AMQP, APIC EM, AWS, Google Cloud. Azure is not on here, but we do have Azure. I mean, there's so many here. I mentioned before the scripting interface. We can treat data as tables. Obviously, making REST calls is a huge part of it. Additionally, interacting with remote shells or terminals, like a switch if you need to automate a switch. This also works with Windows Bash, or not Windows, sorry, Windows PowerShell. So those are the activities. We also have those logical operators I mentioned, condition loops, that's if-else, for each loops, while loops. And then you can take any existing workflow and drag that workflow onto your canvas, so you can create a workflow and then drag it into another workflow. So if I wanted to add my workflow here, then I could just simply add it. I'm going to delete that because I don't want it there. On the left-hand side, anything you have selected, you see the properties, or sorry, the right-hand side. Anything you see have selected, you see the properties for. Since I don't have anything selected, these are the properties of my workflow. So what Git repo, I have this published to, and of course inline I can add a new Git repo if I need to. I see my workflow variables. Variables can be of different scopes. You can have input variable, output variable. So input means that's what you have to provide when you start the workflow. Output means if you're, when you run a workflow, this is the end result of your workflow. Local meaning that it lives within the run of your workflow and then is gone. We also support static variable. In static variable scope means that you create a variable, and then every time you run the workflow, you can update the value of that variable. So you can sort of see the possibilities there. Of course, variable types I mentioned before. Boolean, datetime, decimal, integer, secure string. So if you have a variable inside of a workflow, but you want to protect that variable, maybe it's just sort of a random bit of information that you don't want to expose to anyone who might be looking at your workflow or looking at logs, you can encrypt it within your workflow and set that as a variable type. And then I mentioned before the ability to create your own custom variable types. You can do that, and it works kind of like a table with its own rules associated with it. So I have a number of variables defined here. Some of them are secure string because my WebEx Teams key, I want to keep that secret. DNA Center token, I want to keep that secret, so you can't access that data. It's non-retrievable here. So looking a little more closely at the workflow itself, you see that it works it's based on a Windows style, and there's different ways of representing workflows, and this format is sort of a cascading style as opposed to like a directed acyclical graph or BPMN, if you might be familiar with that. This is based on a Windows style workflow where you basically have a start point and your bit follows that start point. And that's what we see here. We have one activity leading to the next. In this case, this activity is I'm making a REST call to DNA Center to retrieve a token. So that REST call is configured by setting up a target, which I have defined here. It's the DevNet DNA Center that they have provided to us. And that definition is fairly straightforward. What's my protocol? HTTP, HTTPS. What's my IP address or host? We support IPv6, by the way. Is there a port? Is there a common path that I want to ascribe to it? Do I need to go through a proxy, for example? And that will be the remote host that I make my calls to. And then from there, I provide the rest of my URL for my API, what method I want. If there's a body, I have the ability to create custom headers. And in this case, I've created a custom authorization header. And that custom authorization header uses my variable that I have, my secure string variable for DNAC token that I showed here. So it's actually using that directly inside here, so that doesn't get exposed to anyone who's looking. And then you can see that generally the way this works is that you'll have the next step has the ability to refer to the previous step. So in this case, I'm going to do a JSON path query to pull out data from my JSON response from the previous call. So that DNA Center token, that DNA Center, that auth token call is going to return me JSON, right? So I know that. So my next call is I'm going to parse that JSON. So I can come in here and say, okay, well, I want to, from my DNA Center login, I have all of these things available to me, but I'm going to use the body, and that's what I'm going to parse my JSON out of. So it's very declarative in that manner. Everything is all kind of atomic steps. So from there, I know that my JSON path query is going to contain a token that I'm going to assign to a property name token, and I know that is of type string, and I have all the typical types there. And I can pull as many articles as I want from that JSON path query. And then from there, I'm going to get all my devices using the DNA Center APIs. Now that I have my auth token, so same target, making that call to a different URL, and I know it's going to be get, and I'm going to get JSON. And now I'm using a different header, that XAuth header, and that is using the output from that JSON path query. I'm now referring to that directly inside my call. So that's how you would cascade data from one call to the next. And from that, I know that I'm going to receive a large JSON object. That's all my data from that get network device call, which I'm then going to read into a table. So we can create these dynamic tables based on text coming in from XML or JSON or even plain text. And it creates this sort of internal dynamic table. So I'm reading that from JSON because I know I'm going to get an object called response in my JSON. And I know that within that response object, I'm going to have these fields. So it's going to internally, even before I have the data, I'm just going to go ahead and create this internal table within the system. And it's dynamically allocated. So like, for example, if I come in here and I add a field called hello, right? So even though my JSON, when I run it, is not going to have a hello object in it, if I look at the next step down here, I can see that from my read table from JSON activity output, now I have a hello field, and I haven't recompiled anything. I haven't had to write anything new. I declared that, and now it's available to all the downstream nodes. So I don't get myself in trouble, I will delete that. So then with this dynamically created table, I can do a lot of things to it. I can treat it like SQL, where I can query it, I can add rows to it, I can also loop over it. And that is what I'm going to do, is I'm going to loop over it. But then we talked about the notion of being cross-domain, right? So that's one domain is the DNA Center, and I've showed you how I've accessed that one. So the other domain in this example would be WebEx Teams. So what I wanted to do was check WebEx Teams and say, okay, what rooms is this user in? Because I don't want to create a duplicate room. I want to use the room that's already there if possible. So similarly, I have a different target for WebEx Teams that define the same way, HTTPS, API, Cisco Spark. So very similar path there. And I'm using a similar authorization header that I'm pulling from my secure string variable that I created up here. That would be this one right here. And I'm going to get the rooms. So I've got my relative URL of rooms, and I know it's going to get me JSON. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to read it into a table, a dynamically created table that is my items. And I know I'm going to have title and ID, and I'm referring to that output from my last response, that body, right? So with that, I can then take that output from that read rooms into table, and I can now loop over it. So I have a for each loop here, and that read rooms into table now has an output that I can loop over. And every item in that output, every row in that table that I created before is now available in each iteration of my loop. So it becomes an iterable. And within that loop, I'm just going to say, okay, when I ran my workflow, I said I want to create this particular room. So I'm looping over all the rooms to say, does that room already exist in this output? So that's what I have here, a conditional, to say if this input from this loop, if it equals my room title that I gave as my input, which you can see here, the input variable, then that matches the condition. So you can add as many conditions as you want. I have one condition here, but you can add multiple conditions to your block. Within each condition, you can add multiple conditions as well. And depending on the type of data that you feed it, the type of variable you feed your condition up here, the clauses change. So if it's string, then we can match a regular expression or a wildcard. If it is in this case, this is numeric, so I get greater than, equal than, less than. So depending on what you put first, it changes the conditions you have available to you. So basically, if I match that condition, I'm just going to set a variable. So then, similarly, we can set as many variables as we want at any given time. I'm just going to say that's my ID, my room ID that I want to match. and then I can break out of my loop. And then if, for example, the room that I want to create doesn't exist, then I can simply make another REST call to WebEx Teams to create my new room. And in my request body, I can refer to variables. So in my request body, I'm referring to what I gave as my input to say, this is my title. This is what I want my room title to be. So I can refer to those variables within the body that I'm sending to my REST endpoint as well. And then from there, similarly as I did before, I'm doing a JSON path query to pull that data back out. And then as another input to my workflow, I also said, well, who do I want to invite to this room? Is it going to be a list of emails or a group? And in this case, I said emails to invite, so it's a list of emails. And this is a fairly straightforward thing. I'm just going to split this string by a comma. However, you're not limited to comma. You can actually split by any field, and that split can be based on a variable as well. So you're not locked into saying it's just comma or just pipe. You can actually make that a variable. So you can sort of see how, as software engineers, when we were approaching this software, how we had all these little frustrations that we wanted to solve. So there's a lot of these little things within here. So that list of users that I have, I can treat that as an iterable and parse over it, which I'm doing here. I'm just saying that the parts from that parse list, I'm looping over it, and then making a REST call to WebEx Teams to invite them to my room to notify them of any potential issues with these network devices. So going way back up there, I mentioned that I was going to loop over that list of get network devices that we had up here, that I read into a table. So down here, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm saying, okay, well that read table from JSON output here, I'm going to refer to that and make that my iterable. And then within it, fairly straightforward condition, I'm going to say, well, if that status for each one of these, if that status is reachable, then I'm going to make one call to WebEx Teams to say this one's okay, right? Or actually, this one is if it's not reachable, yeah. Then I'm going to notify and say, hey, there's a problem with this one. And again, inside here, I'm referring to my variables to say, I discovered an issue, and that I've got the IP address and then the specific issue. So it's all variable references within it. So that source array had all of these within it that I'm referring to directly. And then the other condition is to say that it was reachable. So I'm just going to create a big multi-line string is what I'm going to do here. And so when it's done, I'm just going to say, okay, well, this IP was good, and I'm just going to append it to itself. And then lastly, I'm going to send that notification out. So I will send it to myself, and if anybody wants to be a guinea pig, I can include you. If you've got WebEx Teams, I'm happy to add your email to this. Does anybody want to be my guinea pig? No takers? Okay. That's fine. I don't blame you. Who knows what I'm going to do with your email? I'm kidding, I'm not going to do it with your email. So anyway, as I mentioned before, input variables are what you're required to pass when you run it. And in this case, I'm running it ad hoc. I'm actually clicking that run button to run it. Ordinarily, in a production environment, you would run it based on some kind of event or a schedule. So this method of running it is really more kind of what you would do for testing. So go ahead and run this. So now we're looking at something different. It generally looks the same, but now this is a run. So now what I see here is I see my workflow. But now instead of variable references, I actually have data. So by the way, feature not a bug, it's refreshing itself So our UI is extremely lightweight. We don't have WebSockets or anything to weigh it down, so we're just simply refreshing. You can turn refresh off. And you can see within this run, now I can see the result. I can see the actual result of my workflow. This particular call, I received a token. And then, as you saw before, I was referring to that token to query, so now I've got my JSON query, and my output that I configured here, now I can actually see my data, when it ran, whether or not it succeeded. Similarly, with my call to DNA Center APIs, now instead of just sort of a variable reference, I can actually see the real data that came back and inspect that for my run. I'll turn refresh back on here. As we move through the workflow, you can see this workflow's succeeded. And like, for example, here, we have a loop. So you can inspect each iteration of a loop. In this case, there was nothing here because it was a new room, so I won't look at that one. But my conditions, you can see you can see the actual conditions that were met and the data that was sent for each one of these calls. And this one is more interesting here. So I have a for each loop that ran 4 times because I have 4 items that were returned in my table. And each iteration of that loop, I can see the different data that was processed. So the first time it ran, I received this information. The 4th time it ran, I received different information. I received one that there was an issue here. So that, and each one of these then sent a notification to WebEx Teams. So if I come over to WebEx Teams, I see that this is, since nobody wanted to be my guinea pig, this was the data that was sent to say, okay, well, there's issues with these servers and the rest were okay. So, tempting the demo gods with a live demo here, that is the run of the workflow. So, getting into a little more detail about some of the higher level features, or I guess maybe lower level, you should say, is I mentioned before that I ran this by clicking run, right? So that's really more sort of a testing way, but what you would actually do in production is you would trigger it. So you can add a trigger here, and triggers can be either based on an event, so something happened on a remote system that I defined, and I'll show you that in a moment, or they can be based on a schedule that I've created. So once you add a trigger, all of a sudden that event is being listened for. And when I look at events, I can define an event based on various criteria. And so all I have here is AMQP, email, and Kafka. So depending on what you have loaded in your system, you can have many different kinds of events. It's an open framework. So say, for example, I have a Kafka event, right? So I can, create my event to say, okay, on this Kafka host, this is not going to work because I don't have this defined, but I can define a new Kafka host. Obviously, it's going to say, okay. And then I say, okay, well, on my Kafka host, what's my topic? So that's the topic that I'm searching through on Kafka, and then I can define conditions to further whittle down how this event is defined. So I've defined this event to say, all right, now I've got an event that I'm listening for to come across that topic. So now I want to run my workflow whenever that event fires. So at this point, I've defined my event, but we're not actually listening for it. So you can define as many events as you want, but until you actually create a trigger for your event, then the system is actually listening for it. so you don't have a bunch of events being listened to that don't matter to anything. So in this case, I might come in and say, okay, now I want to add a new event, the one that I defined, Matt Kafka, right? So I save that. Now we are actually listening for this Kafka trigger, right? And additionally, within that, now if I look at any of my events here, I can actually refer directly to the context of that trigger. I mentioned this before. So the message that comes across that Kafka trigger, or the specific input, like the description, display name, topic name, all of that information is now available to me, which you can see would be very useful if you're triggering your workflow. You want the context of that trigger. And that works the same way for emails as well, also for webhooks. So that's triggers for you. Some of the other neat things you can do. For example, we have Cisco IT uses our software. By the way, who all here is using the Wi-Fi? Haha, yeah, everybody, right? So the NOC here was set up using our software. So AO set up the NOC. There will be a very fascinating talk tomorrow by a man named Jason Davis. I recommend you go to it. He's brilliant. He used our software to set up the NOC. So everything you've seen here, if the service goes down, you can blame me, I suppose. Don't blame me. Anyway, but in a lot of cases, they run so many instances, they have so much going on that they don't want to save all of them. So we can even actually say, okay, well, after it's run, delete the instance because we have 1,000 per minute running. So we allow that. And I wanted to talk, a few minutes left, I wanted to talk about the ability to create custom adapters. So on the left-hand side here, you see this list of adapters here. Not exhaustive of everything you can do. So if, for example, you needed to interact with UDP, okay, well, I'll admit, we don't have UDP as an adapter, right? But you could create your own adapter. The adapter framework is fairly simple to write in. It's basically a microservice. You spin up said microservice within Kubernetes, and there's a fairly simple process of registering your microservice with AO. As an admin, you can create that new adapter. So it's a fairly straightforward process of creating a new adapter. It's all exposed right here. And that's how you would interact with the adapter that you wrote. Anybody who's interested in that, I'm happy to go into that in detail. It's actually fairly fascinating. But aside from that, let's say you don't need to create a new adapter. You don't need to write new code for it. You say, look, I'm going to create this workflow, and this workflow, I just want to publish this workflow as an adapter. So you can do that too. We call it an atomic workflow. So, for example, this is test, the name of this, so obviously this is not very useful. But let's say I wanted to just write a quick workflow that was going to interact with, AWS REST APIs, and I wanted to publish that as an adapter. I can come in here and call this Cisco Live Adapter. Oh. I forgot to create. So I've created my Cisco Live Adapter group, and it's test. So now when I go to create a new workflow, I have Cisco Live Adapter test, and now it just treats it like a regular workflow action. So unless you're an admin, you don't have the ability to even view that this is even an atomic adapter. From your perspective, it's just another activity. So kind of two different ways of creating new adapters. So I am almost out of time. So I just want to give you a quick wrap up here. You know, I mentioned the fact that it's self-documenting, it's modular, repeatable, traceable, consistent, easy to use. You saw me just click through it. You know, I know it very well, but I feel it's fairly easy to use. So before we wrap up here, inside WebEx Teams, you can join the room for this session. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to discuss this. This is my favorite topic, so you know, I'll talk all day about it. And there is a session. There is a session survey if you want to complete. You know, feel free to rate me however you like. And please definitely continue your education here, especially here in the DevNet zone. There's a lot of amazing topics and a lot of very brilliant people. I recommend you take full advantage of that. So with that, thank you. I appreciate you attending this morning, so have a good day.